Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the TIDE Conference Keynote. My name is Maya Hislop. I'm an assistant professor of African American literature here at Clemson. I'm very excited to introduce our guest to this evening. So just a really big thank you to you all for coming, and thank you to all of the people who made this event possible. Dayna Bowen Matthew, JD, PhD, is the Dean and Harold Green Professor of Law at the George Washington University Law School. Completing her undergraduate at Harvard Radcliffe, she then went on to obtain her JD from the University of Virginia, where she was an assistant professor from 1991 to 1994. In 2018, she received a PhD in Health and Behavioral Sciences from the University of Colorado at Denver. In addition to having an illustrious career as a teacher, dean, scholar, and public health advocate, she's the author of Just Medicine, A Cure for Racial Inequality in American Healthcare. The list of awards and accomplishments is stunning and long, and so as to avoid an overly lengthy introduction, I just want to hit some highlights. During her tenure as a member of the University of Virginia Law faculty, Dr. Matthew served as co-founder and inaugural director of the Inequities Center, a transdisciplinary research center that seeks to build better relationships between UVA and Charlottesville community through community-engaged scholarship that tangibly redresses racial and socioeconomic inequality. In 2013, she co-founded the Colorado Health Equity Project, a medical legal partnership incubator aimed at removing barriers to good health for low-income clients by providing legal representation, research, and public advocacy. In 2015, she served as the senior advisor to the director of the Office of Civil Rights for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I'm out of breath just listing these incredible accomplishments, so it's mind-boggling to imagine what it must be like to have actually done all of this amazing work. On a personal note, I feel unbelievably lucky that as a graduate student at the University of Virginia several years ago, I was lucky enough to hear Dr. Matthew speak on the ways that the media representations of the crack epidemic of the 1980s and the opioid crisis of our present day differ, the former largely impacting Black and Brown communities and being considered a criminal issue, the latter largely impacting white communities and being considered a public health crisis. I think about that talk at least once a week. I used to quote the things I remember from that talk at parties back when I used to go to parties to sound smart on issues of which I know very little. As an English professor, I am not a health scholar. The talk was, as you can imagine, incredible. Dr. Matthew spoke with such clarity and profundity about some of the most pressing issues of our time. What struck me most then was the passion with which she spoke about the issue and how she made it so accessible that really anyone could not only understand what she was saying, but see the issue from the many perspectives to which she drew our attention. I know that tonight will be no different from that night. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Dr. Dayna Matthew.
Oh, Dr. Hislop, thank you so much. That was the warmest of welcomes. I had forgotten that we were at UVA at the same time. And it just really is an honor that you remember and have been impacted by something that I said. I hope that I don't let you down now. You said those wonderful things. And if I may, I'm going to go ahead and share my slide deck so that I can make sure I do my best to live up to that incredible and wonderful introduction. So I want to know, Dr. Hislop, can you see my slide, my title slide?
Right now it's just a black screen.
No, that's not good.
I wonder if it's...
Okay, so it's just a black screen. That's not good.
I saw it before when you were... Yeah, like that I can see. So you might...
Okay, so you can see... Okay, suppose I start the slideshow and give you the presenter view. What do you see now?
Oh, that's great. I see today, part 1.
Okay, and you don't see the presenter view, you see the slide.
I see the slide.
Beautiful. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
So I'll go back to my title slide and first start by saying thank you very much for having me. I know this is your first TIDE conference, so there's apparently something going on here at Clemson. There's a movement afoot, information and knowledge gathering effort And Tigers for Inclusion, Diversity, and Ethics is an exciting inaugural event for me to be a part of. So I really appreciate you putting the confidence in asking me to be here for this wonderful start to something that I think will be fabulous. Anybody who's taken a course from me, sadly, sometime during the year, especially if I teach constitutional law, knows that Hamilton is my favorite musical. I love the line that this is not just a movement, it's a movement. I wish for you that the Clemson University Tigers for Inclusion, Diversity, and Ethics is not just a movement, but a movement. So now on to my part to help you get started. I'm a lawyer, as you heard in the introduction, and not everybody wants to listen to a lawyer, so I'm going to make the case in part one of my talk for why I think it's worth hanging in there with me for a message that is about law and what law can do for equity and for ethics. Then I'm going to use the case study of COVID-19 in order to tell you a little bit more about what law can do, both to help and to harm equity and health equity in particular. Who can help? I can tell you the preview of coming attraction is you. Everybody in the sound of my voice has a role, and I have some ideas about what you can do at the very end of my talk. So starting with part one, let me just set the stage for what health equity, the objective that I would suggest we all should be concerned about is. As a lawyer, I'm always concerned with equality. Equality under the law is equal justice under the law is inscribed on the Supreme Court, which is right down the street from me. The Equal Protection Clause is what I teach most passionately in civil rights law. But equity is actually an application of a variety of equality. And this is the meme that we in public health use to show it all the time. Public health specialists look at the top and the bottom of this graph in order to, this meme rather, in order to describe the difference between treating everybody equally, which turns out not to be a way to get equality. If we treat everybody equally, some people will be facing insurmountable barriers to the equality that we seek to serve. And so instead we use in health the concept of equity, that is giving people what they need, when they need it, how they need it, in order to give everyone a fair and just opportunity to be as healthy as possible. How do we do that? Well, one, we get rid of inequality. We get rid of inequality because inequality is the unjust, unfair, and avoidable disparity. Differences, disparities, those words I'll use interchangeably. Differences and disparities that are unjust and that are avoidable and unfair. Inequality, I submit to you, is the greatest threat to health equity in America and worldwide. So if the object is health equity, inequality is the enemy. A very brief set of data just to prove the connection between health and inequality, because that's the founding or fundamental principle that I need everybody to be on board with. If you're not on board with this, the next 20 minutes is going to be quite a bore, because this is the fundamental relationship that I need to incorporate in all that I'm going to say going forward for the rest of my talk. So this slide is intended to make the case for the association between inequality, what I'll call structural inequality, and health outcomes. So on the left, you see inequality measured. Inequality is measured by something called the Gini index. The OECD nations are the largest industrialized nations in the world. And the World Bank has calculated this thing called the Gini index, which essentially, highly simplified, measures the difference or the gap between the income of the highest quintile of earners in a nation and the lowest quintile. So how far apart are these, right? And however far apart these are describes the level of inequality. Inequality is described as a wider gap between the haves and the have-nots, and equality is a smaller gap from a Gini index perspective. So you see on the left-hand side of the slide that the United States, of all the OECD countries, has the highest Gini index, that is the highest gap between the top and bottom earners in the United States. We are the most inequitable from an earning standpoint of all OECD nations. On the left, this graph tells us how that influences, is related to, is connected to, or correlates with health. So this is a graph that takes the income inequality measured by the Gini index on the x-axis from low to high, left to right, and plots it against an index of health and social outcomes. Now, this aggregate index was provided by two researchers, Pickard and Wilkerson, and they calculated based on 10 inputs, differences in health outcomes in heart disease, diabetes, obesity, homicide rates, and social outcomes such as educational attainment. Statisticians that they were able to combine this into one numerical index and use it on the x-axis from better outcomes at the bottom to worse outcomes at the top, and plot those against income inequality. And what's the story that we see here? We see the relationship between income inequality in a nation and health outcomes. It is a direct relationship. You see in the lower left-hand corner, the country of Japan, where the income inequality is small. That is, the difference between haves and have-nots is small, has the best of all the countries' index for health and social outcomes. On the other hand, the United States in the far upper right-hand corner, the relationship between inequality, high inequality, big gaps, large differences across our society between the low earners and the high earners has been correlated clearly with poor health and social outcomes. This is a relationship that I'd like you to hold in mind. Now I want to turn to the law, because I believe that this relationship is not only enabled by law, maintained and sustained by law, but ultimately, and here's the punchline for my entire talk, it can be reversed by law as well. So why law? When you think about the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, you think about the fact that it freed the slaves. It's the Emancipation Amendment that made slavery, slave holding, illegal in the United States and unconstitutional. But if you look closely, the language of this 13th Amendment is not the amendment that is in our Constitution. Indeed, it was the precursor, the predecessor to our current 13th Amendment, the original 13th Amendment. The original 13th Amendment was actually introduced in Congress to do the exact opposite of what our 13th Amendment to the Constitution does. Look carefully. No amendment shall be made, so it's an unamendable amendment, right? If it had been ratified, shall be made to the Constitution, which shall authorize or give Congress the power to do what? The power to abolish slavery or interfere with slavery in any state. That was the original 13th Amendment. And were it that this was only a set of words that didn't go anywhere, I really wouldn't have any reason to bring it to your attention. However, this original 13th Amendment that would have constitutionalized slavery, made it unamendable for the Congress to interfere with state management of and pursuance of the peculiar institution. This was an amendment that passed with the 2/3 requisite votes in the House of Representatives immediately before the Civil War. It passed with the 2/3 requisite vote in the Senate and was on its way to ratification. So 6 states ratified this original 13th Amendment, and we just simply don't know whether it would have gotten the 2/3 of states required under the Constitution to be ratified. We don't know. The reason we don't know is because the Union states fired on Fort Sumter and the Civil War began, and we therefore had no opportunity, thankfully, to see this play out because I might not be standing here. Now, again, this is not just a historical nicety. The great emancipator himself, President Lincoln, referred to this original Corwin Amendment, the original 13th Amendment, with approbation. He said, I have no objection to this 13th Amendment. And the reason I bring that to your attention is to set before you the premise that our laws, even the laws of our Constitution, are ambivalent about equality and equity. We have not yet committed fully to the concept of equity. And that is the reason I submit to you that we continue to have wide
and terrible and costly and deadly health disparities today. But the good news is that the law can be used for good as well. It turns out that we would not have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Fair Housing Act of 1965, the Voting Rights Act. We wouldn't have most of this civil rights legislation had it not been for what we call a watershed case called Simpkins v. Cone. And where did it come from? It came from health providers. 6 physicians, 3 dentists, and 2 patients bought a suit against the hospital pictured in my prior slide to desegregate it, and that lawsuit ended up desegregating 7,163 hospitals across the United States. Law can work for the good. Law can be used to help us achieve equality and equity, and the fact that it is the foundation of inequality gives us a target, if you will, a place to look for the solution. So now, what can we learn about how that solution is needed from the COVID-19 pandemic that we are currently experiencing? I suggest quite a lot. I'm going to skip the next slide because it's out of place. Please forgive me. The COVID-19 pandemic by race and ethnicity. By now, everyone in the audience has heard that it is an inequitable pandemic. The data here from the CDC rather, shows that if you are an American Indian, an Alaskan Native, or a non-Hispanic person in these indigenous populations, the number of cases that you are likely, the prevalence in your community is almost 2 times greater than the prevalence in the reference group of whites. Hospitalization is almost 4 times greater for you, and your death rate is almost 2.5 times greater than the white population. Similarly, if you look at Blacks and African Americans, Latinos and Asians, there are multiples in the African American and Hispanic population of exposure to disease, death, and the incidence of COVID-19. That is called disproportionate morbidity and mortality. It is but one and a recent exemplar of how we experience death and disease disparities by race and ethnicity in this country. If I wanted to spend the rest of the evening, I could tell you about this kind of disparity for almost every disease modality. I could tell you about this disparity for infant mortality, right? And let me be clear that it's a race and ethnicity issue, not a socioeconomic status issue. Why? Because when we look at the difference between the death rate of infants in their first year of life for Black women, Latina women, in comparison to the death rate for infants in their first year of life per 100,000 live births, we see that the multiple does not change with the income and education of women, right? So I'm going to take my former home state of Colorado. In Colorado, it turns out that a Black woman is 2.5 times more likely to lose her baby in the first year of life than a white woman if the Black woman makes between $50,000 and $75,000 a year, middle income, and has a college education, and the white woman has not completed high school, right? So this is a race disparity. What we also see with COVID, as well as many other diseases, I said infant mortality, life expectancy, death due to heart disease, death due to diabetes, so many different health disparities across the spectrum. But again, I'm going to stick with the COVID-19 or coronavirus disease. Why? Because it is an exemplar of something that we see frequently replicated across many disease modalities, across many populations. And so what we have seen and the lessons we've learned is that this morbidity and mortality disparity has to do with the social setting, what we call the social determinants of health, the social influences on differences in exposure to comorbidities, to diseases like heart disease and diabetes, obesity, that are underlying conditions that make it more likely that you and I will have different outcomes and susceptibility to the coronavirus, to the COVID-19 disease. What are those social influences? Well, residential inequality is one. Where you live, housing is a social influence. People who live in more densely populated environments, like the one shown here. Remember, New York was a hotspot in the beginning of the pandemic. People who live in neighborhoods where there are fewer healthy food options. I just learned that Southeast, the quadrant right down the road, DC is divided into quadrants. The Southeast quadrant has 1 supermarket per 80,000 residents, right? I have one supermarket for every 5 people in my neighborhood. I'm exaggerating, but the healthy food options are fewer in neighborhoods. So that's a social input that influences disparate health outcomes. Inferior access to recreational space, inferior access to sidewalks, inferior access to safe, crime-free neighborhoods, all will affect diseases and underlying conditions. Another social input that influences the disparate outcomes for COVID-19 was employment. Employment inequality had a disproportionate effect on essential workers, people who had to get on the train, such as the photograph shown here, in order to go to work and load groceries onto our shelves, or drive the train and bus that kept the public transportation system going, or deliver DoorDash for those of us who were sheltering in place and wanted to order in our food. 30% of all bus drivers in New York City are Black or brown. 20% of all food service workers, janitors, cashiers, and stockers of shelves like Target are Black and brown, and 25% of all those who rode public transportation, where the exposure was greater than those of us who drove in the safety of our cars. In this way, employment inequality exposed people to much greater disease and opportunity for the virus to affect them. This was a social impact on how people experienced the pandemic. Now, one that's a little bit harder for me to connect up without more time, but the data is very clear that educational inequality also positioned people of color to be disproportionately exposed to the virus. Why do I say that? When we look at what we often call at the bottom of this slide an achievement gap, right? The average performance of Black and brown students on standardized tests, graded performance, we think that that is a evidence that some are smarter than others, or some are more prepared than others, or some work harder than others. Nothing could be further from the truth. Indeed, what we call an achievement gap is an equity gap. An equity gap with respect to resources that affect students from preschool through graduate school. How do I mean that? Well, if we had more time and I were talking solely about inequities due to education, I would talk about the fact that inexperienced teachers are predominantly located in schools that are populated by Black and brown populations, that the access to AP, IB, and higher level courses, math, and college preparatory courses is much less readily available in schools that serve predominantly Black and brown populations. These are what we call a leaky pipeline, right? The pipeline that would produce a Clemson student, that would produce an honor roll student, that would prepare a student to prepare the applications that so many of you were successful in getting admitted to this great institution of higher education, are not available. That means that the student population in these inferior schools do have lower performance, but that means they'll also get lower jobs. You as Clemson students will get great jobs. These students will not, and they will therefore have the options of housing, such as I showed you earlier, and jobs such as I showed you earlier. They are all connected, another social determinant of health. Now, the rubber is really going to meet the road because I'm going to introduce the R word, racism. My premise is that one of the lessons that we learned from the COVID-19 virus pandemic is that structural racism kills. Structural racism. What do I mean by racism first, and then what's structural about it? Racism is defined by a great researcher, Kamara Jones, has 2 features. We're not talking about the attitude of bigotry. We're not talking about a prejudiced person that looks at you and makes a judgment about you, not based on the content of your character, but the color of your skin. We are talking about a system, right? An institutionalized system that structures opportunity throughout a society. Right? So racism does this as a system. Number 1, it assigns a value to people based on the color of their skin, this social construct called race. A value hierarchically, you are more valuable than I am because of your race. And how do we know? Because of the second thing that the system of racism does, it assigns access to opportunity, resources, and power according to that hierarchy, right? So when we see that the advantages of society are disproportionately assigned to one group of people because of their value by race, and disproportionately denied to another group of people because of their relative devaluation by race. That's what we call racism. Indeed, that's what we call structural racism. Why structural? Because it affects all structures and institutions in society. That's what we learned from COVID, right? We saw that housing was inequitably distributed. Access to food, access to healthcare, access to education, access to jobs, access to the safety of being able to shelter in place. And this slide defines the revelation of structural racism when we see this pattern replicated throughout society. Throughout societal institutions, we can define structural racism as a system of hierarchical preferences institutionalized by history and by law, and by which power and resources are allocated disproportionately. The last lesson from the COVID-19 pandemic proves that structural racism is alive and well. When we look at the vaccination, the resource, right, that is going to get us outdoors, that is going to free us from social distancing and masks, not yet, we're not there yet. When we look at the very cure that is going to heal and return us to some new normal, it is disproportionately distributed by race and ethnicity. Indeed, the races that are suffering the greatest morbidity and mortality, Hispanic Latino population on the far left, Asian population in the middle, Black population, and on the far right, the numbers are too small to see if American Indian, Alaskan Native, and other Pacific Island populations. We don't have enough data. That is a structural racism problem, but I do digress. But what we see in these populations is that the gray line, which tells us the extent of vaccination, is far below the yellow line for hospitalizations, the orange line for death, and the red line for cases, right? So the people who need, because of the incidence of disease, the vaccination the most are receiving it least frequently. This is structural racism at play. This is structural racism in action. Access to the vaccine, access to transportation, access to the medical facilities to get the cure for the disease that disproportionately is distributed by race has not been made equally available. We don't have health equity, and we've learned that from the COVID-19 virus. So how does that manifest? I'm showing a van here because every time I move institutions, you heard Dr. Hislop tell you that I went to the University of Virginia in 2017. This is my beloved alma mater. I love this school. I loved teaching there, but this was my welcome committee. I joined the University of Virginia in August of 2017, and the guys on the right with the tiki torches were running around the grounds, right? The academical village grounds, yelling, "Jews will not replace us." On the offbeat, they yelled, "Into the oven." Jews will not replace us, into the oven. How do you do that? That's another talk. I talk about dehumanization. The guys on the left, they were there a month before I arrived, getting things ready. This man with the pointy hat spells the Bible B-I-B-I-E-L and says that Jews are Satan's children. These are the individuals that combine or aggregate in order to influence structural racism. But let's not make the mistake of thinking it's only these extreme people that create structural racism. They are a reflection of the structures that we have created. Again, my moving truck took me to the George Washington University Law School. This is a beautiful rendering of exactly where I'm standing right now inside of the building that I'm now privileged to run. But January 6th, I stayed here and was afraid to go home because these guys arrived carrying the Confederate flag in the Capitol, storming the Capitol in order to stop the process of counting electoral ballots, right? This is what structural racism produces. right? We should not, I don't think, my opinion, imagine that these extremists are an aberration. They are a product of what we have done when we tolerate the kind of structural racism that wonders whether we should prosecute a police officer for killing a human being in broad daylight, wonders whether we should prosecute a group of vigilantes for killing Ahmaud Arbery, and wonders whether Amy Cooper did or did not have the right to call and weaponize her whiteness in order to tell a Black man to stop harassing her. These are the manifestations of structural racism. Don't make the mistake of thinking this is the racism itself, that this is an aberration. It's the structures that have produced them, and they are alive and well in healthcare. Healthcare has been one of the most historically segregated institutions in society throughout history. Remember, I said the Simpkins v. Combs case desegregated 7,163 hospitals. There were 7,163 fully segregated hospitals. They had waiting rooms waiting to be desegregated, right? This is a sign that would have been commonly seen in order to tell Blacks to go to one side, whites to go to another side, Mexicans, Venezuelans to go to one side, whites to go to another side. This is a picture of the nurses that would have attended me if I had been born in Charlottesville, Virginia, where I taught in the University of Virginia Hospital. I raise this picture because I want you to know, you can look at me and you can know that the structural racism is not that a thing of that bygone in era, right? I would have been born, this is the truth, I would have been born, attended to by these nurses, which were only allowed to graduate in 2019. They weren't allowed to graduate publicly when they received their nursing degree because they were Black. Same thing for Filipino nurses. They were called the hidden nurses, right? And they would have attended me where? In the basement of the University of Virginia Hospital. Where? In the ward that was delegated for Negro patients. I would have been there. And it was right next to the veterinary ward, right? This is structural racism. This is what we mean by structural racism. Every institution, whether it's housing, employment, food access, environment, every institution discriminatorily distributing the resources, power, and wealth of society based on a racial hierarchy. My next book talks about how structural racism is legally enabled. This is a conceptual diagram of the differences between interpersonal prejudice, right? The individuals who were carrying the flag of the Confederacy in January of 2021 in the nation's capital, how that goes to the social determinants that we've talked about, education, housing, food security, and so forth, how that affects health outcomes. And the bottom of my diagram shows that structural racism is legally enabled, right? Remember the 13th Amendment? We weren't sure which way we wanted to go. That inequality has permeated all of our legal institutions. So that's a theoretical diagram for what I will say plays out in a deadly way in real life. By all estimates, or by the most reliable estimate, approximately 84,000 people die an unnecessary, avoidable, unjust, unfair death due to health disparities each year. 84,000 people. And it costs us about $1.24 trillion every 3 years by our best estimates. So this is costly. How do we get rid of it? Well, in healthcare, we have a model. In healthcare, we have a model for how we get rid of this type of disparity. And the model is distinguished from what we did in education, what we did in voting. What we had to do in order to equalize voting rights was this kind of scene and this kind of scene. This is what we had to do in order to get the vote for Black people, in order to get operationalize the Equal Protection Amendment so that Blacks could go to school in public schools funded by the public fisc. But we did not have to do that to desegregate hospitals. Remember Simpkins v. Combs. That case, along with the advocacy of a group of physicians and allies, Marching here, you see, to ask Congress to pass a Civil Rights Act. The Medical Committee for Civil Rights, later termed or titled the Medical Committee for Human Rights, actually was responsible for a quiet revolution. And there are many books. My favorite one is by David Bretton Smith, but there are many books that talk about the quiet revolution that happened to desegregate hospitals. No hoses, no marches, no dogs leashed on people. Instead, we used the law. And my suggestion is that you can help to use the law again. I see that I'm going too slowly, so I'm going to skip a few slides and tell this last story so that I can go quickly. This story is about the social determinants of health. I just want to leave you with this picture because it's from an event that I'm sure most of you know, and that is Flight 1549, a US Airways flight that took off in one cold January from New York's LaGuardia Airport, hit a gaggle of geese, one engine went out, and the pilot, who is the subject of a movie called Sully, Captain Sullenberger, landed the plane on the Hudson River. Hudson River, January, freezing, not a place that's conducive for life. So the people on the plane, the fact that all 155 souls on board were rescued safely is a great feel-good story. It's really important. But Chelsea B. Sullenberger is the hero. There is still a story to be told by the fact that if you look closely, these people are divided into two very distinct groups. The larger group is standing on the plane's wing as the plane is sinking, and they will be in the water with the wing of the plane much sooner than the smaller group of people who are sitting in life rafts on either side of the front of the plane. What's the difference? The difference is where they were sitting on the plane. If you were sitting in first class, you got a raft, you got a life jacket, you got a flare so that you could wave down help. You probably got a little box of rations so that you wouldn't have to eat people if you were out there for any long period of time. If you're on coach, you are on the wing and you have less of a chance at life the longer this plane is in the water. And the message here is that place matters. Please remember that place matters. Place matters because where you live in the United States of America determines your access to the social determinants of health. The social determinants of health, the social and economic factors that we've been talking about for the entirety of my time with you, housing, education, recreational space, food security, access to medical care, your social and economic factors are not only the most important by this estimate, 40% of the determinant of how healthy you will be. Now compare that to clinical care, right? We all are clear that we need access to clinical care. But when you talk about whether access to clinical care determines how healthy you are or not, it does, but only by 10%. The largest influence are social and economic factors. These are the social determinants of health that are disproportionately distributed by place, by where you are sitting on the plane or where you are living. My place, I grew up in the South Bronx. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how health and place matter in the brief time I have left with you so that I can show you why laws pertaining to discrimination, civil rights laws, are essential to achieving health equity in America. So I grew up in the South Bronx. If you know about the South Bronx, it's not so great a neighborhood, but it doesn't have to be that the discrimination that occurs in the South Bronx is overt anymore, right? We don't need people with signs that say we don't want anybody but white people in our neighborhood. This is a message that was sent to people looking for homes in Detroit, Michigan in 1942. You might think that's a bygone era, but let me show you why it doesn't matter that that sign doesn't appear overtly anymore. In 1937, the Homeowners Lending Corporation did to the South Bronx what it did to the most of the country. It redlined it. That term is probably familiar to you. I've outlined in red the area of the South Bronx where my parents were able to buy a house, but they were not able to buy a house at favorable mortgage rates. Why? Because the Homeowners Lending Corporation, HOLC for short, went throughout the country and identified parts of neighborhoods which were undesirable for lending. Right? These are not a good risk. Now, if it were just that they were not a good rest because the houses were broken or because the location was not suitable for building, I wouldn't have a story to tell. But the story I have to tell is that what made these places undesirable was the quote unquote infiltration of Negroes, the quote unquote infiltration of foreign-born families, right? If you were Negro, Puerto Rican, Spanish, that population increase meant that loans were less available to families like mine looking to purchase a home. That meant that instead of telling me by a sign you have to keep out, the financial difficulty of buying a house made it so that we had the segregated North where I grew up. And let me tell you, the sequelae is a gift that keeps giving. Racial and economic segregation persists in the South Bronx. This is a map from 2018 on the left. The zip code that is nearest my own is on the bottom right, 10454. I'm actually 10472, but 10454 is among the lowest income neighborhoods in the South Bronx today. And I maintain that it's because of the structural racism of laws that originated with redlining, lending, home ownership was denied to small populations of color, and so incomes have continued to suffer. Educational disparities have persisted. The crime rate and the public school quality in the South Bronx, as circled in this map, doesn't need an angry mob, as was confronting this young Black woman integrating the Little Rock High School in 1957. We don't need people following me and calling me the N-word and telling me not to come in, because the gift, again, that keeps on giving is the structural racism that created redlining in 1937 and assured that incomes, that median household incomes would be low, that public school quality would remain low. Today, these are maps from 2018, right? Today in the South Bronx, and did not rely on this type of overt prejudice. And make no mistake about it, I can't linger here, but Hahn and Truman, if you look it up, have a wonderful article connecting educational attainment to poor health outcomes, right? Poor jobs, as I said earlier, but also poor social supports, poor social standings, poor working conditions. All of this leads to the fact that you are going to do better in life if you are educated. This is another study by Montez et al. Showing that all you have to do is get a high school education, and your life expectancy increases, right? Again, another map of the South Bronx. Educational and health disparities persist in the South Bronx today because of asthma being the highest concentration in New York City of childhood asthma is in the South Bronx. And it's not just because children with asthma move to the South Bronx, it's because of structural racism. The location of truck routes, waste stations, dumps, and other pollution sources is highly concentrated in the Bronx, South Bronx, where I live. And as a result, no surprise there, the health outcomes reflected as well. We don't need food insecurity, as shown in this 1942 slide, where people tried to integrate a lunch counter at a Woolworths, and an angry mob poured ketchup and yelled racial invectives for them. We don't need that kind of overt racism anymore, because in the South Bronx, the proportion of those who have not had enough food to eat in the last 2 weeks is highest in the dark colored circle that's shown on the map in the middle. That's my home in the South Bronx, where the concentration of Black and brown population is highest in the city. Look also at the incidence of obesity, that underlying condition that predisposes the population in the South Bronx to higher morbidity and mortality by COVID. It is located in the same places that were redlined, in the same places that experience high crime rates, low quality schools, high food insecurity, high obesity, and there is more. In the South Bronx, we don't need the kind of horrific rough justice that is shown in this horrid slide of people being hung. Here are 2 men hung for allegedly whistling at and being attentive to a white woman. They had no right to do this, according to the mob that hung them, lynched them. We don't need this kind of overt racism when we have structural racism to arrest Blacks and whites so widely disparately for marijuana charges. And the reason I call this structural racism is because when you compare the difference in arrest rate on the right to the difference in the use and prevalence of use of marijuana, Blacks and whites use marijuana at about the same rate, but look at the structural difference in the criminal justice system nationally. This is not just the South Bronx, nationally. And these data are only till 2014. I have to update this slide. I have it for 2015, 16, 17, and 18. The prevalence of use is closer and closer each year. And yet the arrest rate for marijuana possession by race continues to be vastly different. This is structural racism. What do we do about it? Well, there are some things we can do individually. I'm going to go through those, but I'm going to tell you that's not the answer. You can be responsible for individual debiasing. We're all subject to racial bias. It's another talk altogether. I'm happy to give it another time, and we can all debias ourselves, assuming that we have stereotypes about people, we make judgments about them, and we act on those judgments. Even if we are the most egalitarian, progressive, well-meaning people, we have evidence that individual biases will direct patient care, teacher to student interactions, our interactions with each other. We can debias our organizations. That means making sure that we admit students of color, that we hire faculty of color, that we employ people of color at the same rate so that our workforce is diverse, our decision-making units are diverse. We can do that organizationally, but the parting message I want to leave with you is that we also need a civil rights law revival in this country. We need to revive the concept of equality under the law. We need to revive that general concept that would address inequality in housing, segregation in schooling, discrimination in our policing, discrimination in our location of food sources, tax laws, civil rights laws. We need to revive these. Now, law alone won't do the job, but it will begin to reflect a new social norm. And we have lost our way. We have lost our way with respect to the civil rights law. We have lost our way with respect to the equality required for the voting franchise. Recently, you've heard that 230 plus laws have been passed in order to suppress the vote of people of color in the state of Georgia. This is why I suggest and submit to you, we have these vast inequalities in this society, because we have not reckoned with equality in civil rights terms, in humanitarian terms. And what we need is another quiet revolution, another allied driven, participated in fight for civil rights for all, for human rights for all. It is all of our problem. And I close with this slide because this picture of redwood trees, which appear to be individuals in their organic stand in a forest, are no more individuals than you and I are in a society. We are connected. We are connected as these redwood trees are connected underground by an integral network of root systems that produce the strength which allows them each to stand. We saw it in the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw that ignoring the pandemic when it was concentrated in Black and brown urban centers like New York and Detroit and parts of Louisiana and Chicago, we did that to our peril, so that now over 538,000 people have died, all walks of life, all parts of the country. And we suffered as a society thinking that it was them and not us. Structural racism kills us all. And the civil rights law that is needed to reverse it is all of our interest and responsibility. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Matthew. I don't know if you can see me. Okay. That was wonderful. In the interest of time, we have about 20-ish minutes for questions, and there are several. So we'll see if I also have a few questions. We'll see if we can get through the ones, and people can continue putting questions if they want to. It looks like Portugal and the UK are two of the lowest on the Gini index, was it that?
Gini index.
But we're similar to the United States on the right-hand graph. How does that correspond with what you were talking about for the US?
Okay, say it one more time so that I can hear it. It looks like Portugal and
the UK, it seems, are two of the lowest on the index, but we're similar to the US on the right-hand graph.
So it's a great question. So structural inequality, and I talked about inequality with respect to income, but structural inequality goes beyond income. It goes to all of the social determinants of health. And one of the ways that the UK stands out, and it's very similar to the United States in this way, is that it's not only incomes that separate people, but class, right? So your access to good jobs, good education, good food sources, all of that in addition to your lack of access to income is structurally embedded in the way that they distribute resources throughout the society. So the Gini index is just one indicator, right? And it does a good job of showing us the relationship, but it doesn't tell the whole story. So countries like the UK, where the Gini index tells part of the story, but more of the disparities between the haves and the have-nots are embedded in the social structure, makes the outcomes worse.
And I believe this question is in reference to the system of racism that you were talking about. It was asked around this time. So it says, how do we get rid of this system of racism? And do you ever think it will go away? Which I know you sort of touched on that at the end of your talk, but if you wanted to.
Yeah, I do think it will go away. I think we're in a moment, quite honestly, a moment for a movement where the pandemic has caused us to pause. The death of George Floyd has caused us to look racism straight in its face, and COVID-19 has played out something that, quite frankly, is not new, right? The disparities that we are seeing in COVID-19 morbidity and mortality, as I've said earlier, replicate throughout all of the health systems and many, many disease modalities. So we knew it was there, but we have a stark reminder. We're pausing to look it in the face, right? Again, I live in Washington, D.C., and I went down the day after President Trump had his photo op at Lafayette Square. And the people who were there marching to say that Black Lives Matter were of all races, of all ages, of all walks of life, right? It is my belief that we have an opportunity. We could miss the opportunity. We could blow it. We could let it pass. But we have an opportunity to say we want to be better. We want to be what we say we are, right? Because when you think about what our Declaration of Independence says, all men and women are created equal. It doesn't say women, but I say women, right? All men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. This is who we want to be, right? Our equal protection clause, emblazoned over the entrance to the Supreme Court of the United States, equal justice under the law. This is who we want to be. My suggestion is we have an opportunity to be that, because right now we see where we must target in order to accomplish it, right? And we have more people, I think, seeing it for the first time, experiencing it for the first time, understanding how embedded in our society it is for the first time, and willing to confront it.
Excellent. How much of COVID cases and deaths would you allude to lack of physical activity, along with people turning away vaccines as their leaders or idols are not suggesting it, i.e. LeBron James?
Yeah, so there's data on this, right? A couple of things. First, vaccine hesitancy is not the cause of inequality in vaccine uptake. It's just not. The data that we get from the Pew Foundation shows that 61% of Blacks and Latinos, as well as whites, want to be vaccinated, right? The data that we get from the Pittsburgh University School of Pharmacy, Dickinson School of Pharmacy, tells us that the biggest barrier to Black and Brown access to vaccine is not their hesitancy, their desire not to have it, but the distance they have to travel to get to a healthcare provider that provides it, right? So what we're looking at is, again, structural inequality by race, so structural racism. And so we know that it's not because people are listening to LeBron James, right? It's people are not in neighborhoods where they have access to the health opportunities that others have. I'm going to get to the question of physical inactivity in a moment, but first let me tell you about my vaccine. I got vaccinated last Thursday. Thank God I'm too young to get vaccinated in Washington, D.C. That made me feel really good, even though I wanted my vaccination. So in order to get it, I had to get online. I have an address in another state, and I have an address. I own property in 2 states, right? Privilege, right there. So I could say I have 2 other states that I have a house in, so I could look, right? And I work in this office, and my boss does work down the street, but he wasn't going to dock me if I took some time off from work to drive to this other state to get the vaccine once I'd located it, right? And I had this nice computer set up that allowed me to refresh every so often to make sure that I could get into a registry in 2 different states and check and see whether I could get my vaccine. So you're getting my drift. I had a lot of structural privilege that people who are Black and brown in our country and people who are white and poor in our country do not have, right? So when I found a place, I got in my car and I drove 2 hours to get to the vaccine location. And here's where I'm really going to start a rant. The first thing they asked me for was my driver's license, fare, and my insurance card. My insurance card? In the middle of a pandemic for a free vaccine? And I got interrogated about my insurance card. Well, they wanted to charge my insurance, I understand. But if I am poor, if I am undocumented, if I am a person who does not speak English as my first language, the likelihood that I'm going to go back and tell my friends to go get their vaccine from there is very, very high. I'm not going to tell them to go get their vaccine from there. Why am I telling you this? Because much more important than vaccine hesitancy, which is not empirically the reason people aren't getting vaccinated, much more important than lack of activity is our structural barriers that are preventing people who are from marginalized populations from getting access to care. Now, let me talk about a sedentary lifestyle. We saw on the graph of the social determinants of health that while economic and social influences had approximately a 40% influence on health outcomes, they were 40% responsible for determining health outcomes. Health behaviors were about 30%, not far behind, right? But let's talk about health behaviors in a social context, right? Let's talk about how if I'm one of the 30% of New York City bus drivers who is driving a 12-hour shift like my father did when he drove a New York City subway and comes home to the South Bronx where I lived and grew up the first 18 years of my life to streets that were not safe, how likely is it that he's going to play a game of tennis? How likely is it that he's going to find time to jog in the park? There wasn't a park. There's no park, right? So there are social structures that influence what we call health behaviors. I'm not saying that they are entirely responsible, but I want us to be very careful about overfreighting this notion of personal responsibility when personal responsibility occurs in the context of a social setting. If I work a 12-hour shift and come home to a neighborhood that is a food swamp with only fast food as my options, right? Like Southeast, right down the street, Washington, D.C. The fact that I prefer Wendy's to Chard is not a personal responsibility choice. It's structurally influenced. The fact that I don't have time to exercise is not a personal responsibility choice. It's a structural choice given the jobs that are available to me. I got to have 2 of them. I got to have 2 jobs in the United States now if I want to buy a 2-bedroom apartment because we don't believe in the minimum wage. That structure is why I'm sedentary. It's not my personal choice.
And just to add on, we're both from New York, so I'm like staying up on New York as well. And a part of the vaccine inequality that I noticed too was that there was an effort to build vaccine centers in majority Black and brown neighborhoods. And white people from the suburbs were coming to those centers and and people would see them in line and think, oh, this isn't, I can't wait. I can't afford to wait. So there's all kinds of ways that the vaccine rollout is impacting people like you're talking about. What about, oh, sorry, the pictures and evidence of racism you provide mostly consist of white people being racist. Do you promote the idea that any race can be racist? And how often do you hear of other races being racist?
I do not promote the idea that any race can be racist. Any race can be discriminatory. Any race can act on stereotypes. But you have to remember that racism is a structure and a system. It's not an attitude that individuals have. And the system and the structure is enabled by power and history that any race does not have other than the white race in the United States, right? So the system and the structure, right, that historically created a constitutional system that allowed this one to vote and that one not to, this one to live here and that one not to, right? Does it mean all whites are racist? No, that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that the structures that create structural racism are a product of white supremacy in the United States of America, right? Now, that is not to say that I cannot be racially biased. I have a whole nother talk that tells you that I, as your Black patient, if you're my white doctor, I can look at you and make some stereotype judgments that make your race of people and the experiences that I've had, call up all of that information. And I'm going to freight it on you as an individual, right? That is discriminatory. That is a use of bias, and anybody, any race, we're all susceptible to it. I am, you are, excuse me, I am, you are. And yes, we can all be bigots. We can all be prejudiced. We can all be biased. We cannot all create a structure of racism because we don't have the history and we don't have the power. It was white supremacy that created that.
Oops. What about when BLM organization were rioting in the streets, breaking into buildings, spray painting businesses, stealing from businesses, burning down buildings in the streets? Why not mention any of that?
So the reason I don't mention that, and I'm happy to now, is because so much of that is a distortion of what Black Lives Matter stood for and stands for, right? So one of the things that I did mention was my Black Lives Matter experience here in Washington, D.C. It was peaceful. It was multicultural. It was multi-generational. And it was consistent with the message that Black Lives Matter, if you go on their website, articulates for themselves. When you ask me to focus on a group of people who rioted, you ask me to consider the Ku Klux Klan as exemplary of Christianity. You ask me to look at the extremist who carried a flag for the Confederacy as the representation of whites in America, right? You ask me to generalize from the small and the specific to paint a picture of the whole, and I won't do that because there are exceptions. And I believe what you saw with respect to rioting had lots of press coverage in certain areas of the country on certain venues, but it was not what Black Lives Matter stood for, stands for, and in large part does. So just think about Ku Klux Klan and their declaration that they stand for a Christian America, and ask yourself whether I should represent them as Christianity. I should not, and will not do that for Black Lives Matter either.
That's the best response I've ever heard to that point. Clemson is a prime example of structural racism that walks the border between glorifying its racist past and remembering in the sense of awareness. What are some ways you believe Clemson or any university could improve its presentation of its past?
I love this question because I love higher education and what it can do to make a society better, right? The reason I'm called to lead an institution, a great institution of higher education, is because I believe we anchor society in what can be good and what can be best in a way that no other institution in the world does. So in most cities, and I suggest Clemson is no exception, where there is a great university like Clemson, like George Washington University, we are the largest employer. If we did nothing but pay a living wage, we would improve health outcomes, right? We are the largest procurer, so that if during the pandemic, instead of laying off workers, we held their jobs, supported their income, we would do more for equity, health equity, and equality to make sure that these workers were not displaced. We are the largest landowner in the cities in which we occupy. If we owned land responsibly, creating affordable housing, not unaffordable housing, by our land grab for wealthy tuition-paying students, right? If we did only those three things as institutions of higher learning, pay a living wage, use land responsibly, and employ and purchase responsibly, we would change health equity, we would change inequality in our midst. And think about how many higher education institutions, Yale and New Haven, same disparities. Harvard and Cambridge, same disparities. Columbia and Harlem, same disparities. UNC and Chapel Hill, same disparities. Brown in Providence, Rhode Island. You see the pattern? We as institutions of higher education are anchors in our communities, and we can change by the way we purchase, employ, pay, and use land, and we'd make a world of difference.
Can you re-explain or elaborate on the difference between socioeconomic disparity and racial disparity? I'm still confused on the difference.
Yes. So the best example is infant mortality, right? There is no question. I might have a slide. It would take me a little bit to find it, but let me see if I can. Just give me 1 second. A picture is worth 1,000 words if I can find it really quickly. And it's not a slide I show often, but it's a great slide. It was, if I can find it, it's from an article by Lincoln Phelan, and their contribution to this discussion about the difference between race and socioeconomic status is absolutely awesome. And I'm not going to be able to find it in time. So let me see if I can do it, if I can paint the picture with my words. Okay. Socioeconomic status, think about a Venn diagram, right? Is a large circle. Within that circle is race and ethnicity. So the large circle, socioeconomic status, right, tells me what my income, socioeconomic status most often measured by income and by education, right? So that tells me where people are on the income and the education spectrum, right? Black, white, everybody goes into that circle. And we can have low SES, socioeconomic status, and high SES people of any race, right? And there's good evidence that people of low SES who are white have a lot of the same discriminatory lack of access to social determinants of health as people who are Black, Latino, Indigenous. Here's the rub. A higher proportion of Black, Latina, Indigenous people are in that low socioeconomic status circle than whites, right? So it's not just a higher number. There are actually a higher number of whites who are poor than there are Blacks who are poor in this country, right? Actually, absolute numbers, right? But the percentage of population, right, that is by race and ethnicity concentrated in the lower socioeconomic statuses is much higher for Black and brown marginalized populations. That's point number one. Point number two that's exhibited by the infant mortality problem that I described is even those who are Black and brown and wealthy and well-educated will still suffer more of the adversity from discrimination and lack of access to social determinants than those who are white and poor, right? So it tells you that race does its own work, right? That race is doing its own influential adversarial work to depress outcomes by health, health outcomes by race, to adversely affect housing, right? When we look at segregation maps around the United States, there are parts of the United States that are as segregated as they were in 1954 when we passed Brown versus Board of Education. In those parts of the country, not in every part of the country, but in those parts of the country, a Black child who is middle class is more likely to live in a neighborhood of concentrated poverty than a white child who has a low socioeconomic status, right? So that tells us that while socioeconomic status class does some of the work of sorting our populations out for inequality purposes, it doesn't do all of the work. It doesn't do all the work. It disproportionately fails to sort those who are affected by race and ethnicity alone. That's the difference that I'm trying to highlight.
I'm going to skip one of the questions just because I think you referenced it already, and I want to focus on the health-focused questions. For someone that wants to be a doctor, how do you suggest they address the racial inequalities in healthcare?
Oh, a couple of things. First of all, when you study medicine, study public health as well, right? And it's not clear to me that your your medical school will do that for you. We're just now getting to the place where we're learning to look at not just therapies for health, for illness, right? Once people become sick, they're in the hospital and we have to rescue them. But we're starting to look at a public health perspective that is look way upstream. By upstream, I mean, look at where people live, work, and play. Look at their housing as a matter of health. Look at where there are the air that they breathe as a matter of health, and become active, secondly, in the movement for civil rights, just like those six physicians and 3 dentists who brought Simpkins versus Cone, just like those physicians who marched on the Committee for Civil Rights. When you become a physician who cares about the social environment of your patients and dares to have a voice for equality in those social environments, you change the world.
Do you think that there are more white people being tested and vaccinated in the United States because there are more white people in the United States when compared to African Americans?
No, because these are percentages. Right now, we have approximately 13.5 million people that have been vaccinated. 2/3 of those are white, right? Only 8% of the people who've been vaccinated are Black. 9% of the people who've been vaccinated are Latino. 2% of the people who have been vaccinated are Asian. Fewer than 1% of the people who have been vaccinated are Pacific Islanders, right? That's proportions of the population. That's not absolute numbers. It's not because there are more white people. It's because white people have better access to the vaccine than people of color.
And this will be our last question of the night. What do you perceive as viable strategies for a civil rights revival when there are many legislators that do not believe in systemic and structural racism?
Vote
and
them out.
Favorable to these efforts?
Vote them out, right? Stop voting ideologically and begin voting for the society we want to be. Stop voting from your echo chamber or even your self-interest, right? I vote for a low tax rate, right? Or I vote for the guy that's going to build a bridge. Vote for the society that we want to be. Command and demand that your elected officials place a high priority, indeed the highest priority, on equity, equality, and this is the society we want to be, the beloved community that we want to be. Vote them out.
Thank you so much, Dr. Matthew. That was an incredible way to end such a brilliant talk and a wonderful conversation. Thank you all so much for coming. I just want to say some announcements from the organizers. Please help us by completing a feedback survey that will pop up at the end of this Zoom session. It's only a few minutes. And keep up with future events from the Rutland Institute on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Clemson Ethics. And if there are any last minute things, they'll go in the chat. But otherwise, good night to everyone. Thank you all so much.
Good night. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go say good night.